Well, this is a most fantastic audience. This is the best and no doubt most vibrant audience we've had for a Durham Castle lecture. I can think of all sorts of people who've come before who I might say, you know, never commanded such an audience. We've unfortunately even had to turn some people away. That's the limits of an old great hall, but this great hall has never been so full in the 2 years I've been here. This is your introduction in a way. This is your introduction. There's very little I need to say in addition, but I'll say a few words anyway. It is, of course, a fantastic pleasure and an honor for me to have our great and distinguished visitor here this evening to give one of our Durham Castle lectures. Professor Spivak was born in Calcutta, where she studied until you completed your undergraduate studies there, or almost? No, I completed them. As a third-year graduate student, and then she went to Cornell, where she did complete her postgraduate research. She is now a university professor at Columbia, which a university professorship is the highest honor given to a very, very few professors at Columbia University, and a founding member of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Gayatri Spivak is considered, of course, the world's most renowned critical theorist. I wrote a book on critical theory a long, long time ago, but this, the standing you have and the admiration you have is, of course, at a different level. And your work has defined, as many of you know here, the field of post-colonial studies. Perhaps best known for the essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Your work, of course, has relentlessly explored the legacy of colonialism, and it focuses on those who are marginalized by dominant strains and patterns of Western culture. Edward Said once wrote, "She has pioneered the study and literary theory of non-Western women and produced one of the earliest and most coherent accounts that we have." Of course, much more than that, I would say, but nonetheless, a nice quote from Edward Said. Professor Spivak has published numerous academic and literary texts. I'm only going to mention a few. Among her academic books are Myself, I Must Remake, wonderful title. That's The Life and Poetry of W.B. Yeats. In other words, Essays in Cultural Politics and Selected Subaltern Studies, all of which, of course, are incredibly well known. And she is, of course, the translator of that formidable of books, Derrida's Of Grammatology. Among her literary achievements and books are Imaginary Maps, Old Women, and Song for Kali, A Cycle. Terry Eagleton once remarked that much of her writing was difficult, and he even went on to say, sometimes inaccessible. And I gather the introduction, the first paragraph of tonight's lecture, might be inaccessible, but at least the author knows what she wants to say. But most importantly, he went on to add, there are few more important critics of our age. She has done more long-term political good in pioneering feminist and post-colonial studies than any of her other colleagues. Her latest book, An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization, explains a new, rather different approach, I gather, to your thinking. I haven't read it yet, but I much look forward to it. There have, of course, been numerous prizes and honors, including in 2002, the Kyoto Prize in Arts and Philosophy for being, quote, a critical theorist and educator speaking for the humanities against intellectual colonialism. And she also received the Bhushan Prize, the third highest civilian award given by the Republic of India in 2013. Tonight, the theme is Humanities and Development. Please join with me in giving our guest an incredible welcome.
Can you hear me? No. Yes? In the back? Wonderful. Thank you so much for turning up. I'll try to do my best, but it is true, the very first paragraph, you can always ask me in the Q&A. I wish you would, in fact. On the other hand, it's like that because I couldn't say what I wanted to say at the length that it required. Talk would have been too long. You know, you folks will find this kind of problem for your papers, oral presentations, as we call them in the United States. Humanities and development. Both development and democracy are open-ended English loanwords. Development comes to us, perhaps from the Gallic Celts, to mean not top-down measures, but unfolding. I'm generally against constative etymologism, but it can be ethico-politically embraced as transformative. I will not here elaborate on the difficult practical task of forging a practice through claiming complicity in its root sense of being folded together, except to point out that it can be performatively related to development as unfolding, folded together, unfolding. Together, top and bottom, under different conditions. You develop the top as well. It's a mistake to think only the bottom needs to be developed if you think of it this way. Top and bottom under different conditions, contaminating the unconditional. This last bit is a little difficult, but we can talk about it. The problem here for me and for all of us is that this sense is available in English, but not necessarily in all of the languages in which the world is proficient. Finding a synonym for complicity, folded together, in Bengali, my mother tongue, for example, is not going to give me a sense of folded togetherness that will pass to the members of the marginalized communities. At the rural schools where I train teachers, I have been practicing this epistemological task for 30 years, how to take my folded togetherness with the subalterns across the mindset they have been permitted millennially, not permitted intellectual labor by the caste Hindus. Colonialism was just day before yesterday. We've been doing it for thousands of years. So this task, how to take my folded togetherness with the subalterns across in the mindset they have been permitted millennially, rather than lose them by finding a synonym. Remembering the marks of the 18 Brumaire, I have to forget English as I produce in their regional Bengali, even as I try desperately to make the teachers' heads work at teaching English as it should be taught. This is the kind of problem that one regularly confronts with subaltern social groups. At the end of the last book published by Derrida in his lifetime, Rogues, he proposes something that marks out the impossibility of the taking on of world-saving projects by metropolitan intellectuals or indeed governments. I quote, "It remains to be known to save the honor of reason, how to translate. For example, the word reasonable, for us, development, democracy, humanities. And how to greet, Derrida continues, beyond its Latinity, for us, Celticity, Hellenicity, and Latinity. In more than one language, the fragile difference between the rational and the reasonable, for us, between the capital D, capital H words, democracy, humanities, and the words in small d, small h, and also between human and humanity in the various languages that do not belong to the Latin and Anglo-Saxon groups, to learn how to translate not just by finding a synonym. In the last public performance that we did together, Derrida was kind enough to name me as the task of deconstruction, changing the word tash from my meaning, stain, to the other meaning, task. Fulfilling that task, which cuts, and of course, for Derrida, a task is something that cuts unconditionality by conditions, because you can't, like most freedoms that you have, you cannot exercise them without binding them to causes. In the same way, unconditionality has to be always contaminated by conditions. You can't do unconditional ethics, and that's task. Fulfilling that task, which cuts unconditionality by conditions and negotiates with failure, given to me by my friend, I say that although this is an excellent lesson for the elite, from the point of view of the subaltern, translations do not help. because generally these translations, as I have pointed out in the case of the Declaration of Human Rights, are not accessible at the subaltern level. It is the Creole that passes into the language, because English and occasionally French remain the dominant language. Therefore, the fact that the lowest sector of the electorate is crucial in the counting of votes, we, the so-called educated classes, do not learn how to access their active creolity epistemologically as we go on translating human rights. This undoes the supposed connection between democracy and the will of the people. Absolutely crucial for those of us in the humanities who take the task of supplementing vanguardism seriously. To give you a European sense of this, I quote a passage from Davide Messina in a paper given recently at the University of Edinburgh, summarizing a light lunch conversation between him and me a year ago. He just sent me this and I was blown away. I quote Davide. Comparative world literature, Spivak maintains, is fieldwork in the creolization process of the world's history. She opened my eyes, this kind colleague says about me, to the literatures of the world through the world of comparative literature. In her book entitled Death of a Discipline, she explained that Complit will have a future as far as it is able to learn from below, namely both from the cultures of the Southern Hemisphere and from the ethnic minorities that constitute the living history of Western nations. The dying discipline, as it were, has the essential function of complementing other disciplines, he continues, in raising awareness for the dying languages of the colonized world, empowering creolization against mondialatinization, which is Derrida's word, world Latinizing, global Latinizing. The disciplinary death is but a longer interdisciplinary life, he continues, with the real historical world in constant view, always critically combining poetics and politics. We could say it again, and this is what I actually told him. I talked about Dante as a Creole writer, which he was absolutely shocked in the beginning, and this whole thing talks about how important it was for him to hear that. We could say it again with Dante, he writes, who established his linguistic vision during his lifelong exile on the following political principle. To the poet, the world is homeland like the sea to fish. Mundus est patria velut piscibus equor, Dante. In Latin, but Italian, of course, was Latin Creole. It was my good fortune, now it's me, to share a podium with Lord Adair Turner, a British financial wizard, I don't have to say that to this audience, on June 7th in London. He emphasized again and again that rich countries, and rich was his word, produced statistics correctly, and statistically, the United Kingdom was, quote, rich. I'm usually invited to give talks by radical groups, often students. Therefore, I quite honestly asked that if my student audiences in the UK were insisting that the denationalization of their education and the enforcement of student loans as, quote, free choice was destroying the prospect of an educated future, if on the television we were witnessing police aggression on students, if yearly income ceilings were being imposed upon people coming into the United Kingdom, how was I going to define or understand the word, quote, rich as applied to Britain? Statistics are useful, but existentially impoverished. Words are full of history, and I, as a wordsmith and a concerned citizen of the world, had every right to ask this question. All this simply so that we can acknowledge the limits of our top-down English-only conclusions. Please remember that I love the English language. I'm a teacher of English, and I'm not a nationalist. I have lived in the United States for 52 years, so this has nothing to do with being Indian or being against English, but it's just to realize the limits of what we do. Development can be, having recognized these limits, let's talk a little bit within those limits. Development can be in any direction, It does not bring with it a value system. It is an unconditional thing, but is always constrained by conditions, and in our world, by economic considerations. That's how we understand the word. It is what I call sustainable underdevelopment, because it is often the level of development that is kept at a minimum so that profit maximization can be sustained. The word sustainable is also open-ended and does not carry any conditions within it. But the prevailing conditions are established and controlled by knowledge management and toolkits. The world's most powerful developers, the World Economic Forum, supposedly want to make capitalism equitable beyond mere corporate responsibility. And they're not all villains. They're rich, that's a problem, but I was brought up to despise the rich, but hey, you know. So they're not all villains. And yet, those who have goodwill, the greatest goodwill, is hindered by a knowledge management approach, putting limits on what counts as language, for example, and offering toolkits. No epistemological change can be brought about by list-making games. I don't know how many of you folks have been or have been taught these knowledge management ways of finding solutions, but that's what they are, list-making games. And offering a list of do's and don'ts, which is the toolkits, I mean, in terms of the international civil society, gendering, you name it, ethics. Toolkits are all over the place, even little villages of Asia and Africa, toolkits. A list of do's and don'ts for checking off, then you've done it. This is where the humanities kick in. Literature and philosophy, reading and philosophizing, when taught as historical theoretical practice, thick for literature and rarefied for philosophy, but in this argument working together, can prepare minds that can rethink, perhaps find ways to redo development, unfolding, by acknowledging complicity being folded together. We have two broad models of development based on the public and private sectors. Public sector models have led to state capitalism and private sector models to private capitalism. By corollary, working welfare states have had to be demolished or reduced. International civil society, often unwittingly, manages the public-private shuttle of capitalist globalization. When we consider this, we confront the impossible task of bringing back the democratic welfare state. Although drawn by justified self-interest, this was the hope of the Arab Spring and of the occupiers of Wall Street. But they had no access to the sources of power without playing by power's rules. Democracy, power to the people, is the only system of government that is hospitable to all kinds of ways of thinking and therefore always threatened. It cannot be driven if the electorate is not educated in a judgment that can be directed toward others. This, as you know, has been diagnosed as the double bind between liberty, which is supposedly unconditional, and equality, which imposes a condition to be aware that others, even completely unlike you, are supposedly imaginable by you as equal. When I work this through the formula, other people's children, a formula that travels from subaltern to elite, I'm told that it is a liberal biopolitical notion. Yet, it is a formula available to already constituted epistemologies and can therefore be used to rearrange desires, the baseline of humanities education. And my idea of acknowledging limits is also to acknowledge the limit to the power of being theoretically correct, hands clean, within your own kind of educational development, as it were. Both feminism and deconstruction are able to think the child as absolute event without compromising reproductive rights or human beings' right to choose. The child is unconditional, like justice. Reproductive rights, an important condition, like law. Again, before we proceed, let us acknowledge our limits. Anyway, the completely accepted translation of the word democracy in my mother tongue, Ganatantra, which my co-workers and most male voters know, gives no clue as to a possible meaning, although, and of course, they vote, sometimes more than once. And as I have said many times, their intelligent analysis is that voting is like competitive sports. Who promises most, performs least, wins. And the public flaunting of breaking the law by the party in power erodes even that little bit of intelligent analysis. The concept metaphor of democracy becomes inaccessible as power to the people, except as violence. I say to my subaltern teachers and supervisors in the villages that I try to say in the outside world when I am called upon to speak about matters of social justice. Try explaining that convincingly. What I have learned from my own mistakes with them in the last 30 years. For example, to keynote at the University of Utrecht on the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Utrecht, let me quote, but also let me say to you that before I went, I actually shared this in Bengali with my subaltern supervisors and teachers. And you know, some of them, the agriculture guy has had 4 years of schooling. Okay, the education guy, 7 years, and very bad schooling. So to an extent, this is what I learned from them that I then dish out at Utrecht. And I spoke to them and I said, look, this is, you see, said I, what we talk about is what I'm going to say there. And then I tried to explain what the cultural self-representation of the Treaty of Utrecht was in the Netherlands. As a result of our association, they at least now have a sense of the map. And then I read the sentences to them in English that I'm going to read now, as I did at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, telling my supervisors and teachers for a second time that I was going to submit the wisdom that I had received from them and which, because of historical cognitive crimes, I was unable yet to act on. It's very hard to access minds that have been millennially cognitively damaged. And you know, NGOs, when they go in, they know what to do. They don't know a damn thing. I can talk about it in the Q&A. And it's not a question of building buildings and giving textbooks and computers and so on. So because of historical cognitive crimes, I was unable yet to act on. I was able in Delhi, which my associates in the villages know as a remote place of absolute control and glamour. Most of them have never been to Calcutta, which seems to them to be a grand metropolis. Never seen white people for sure. At any rate, in Delhi, I was able also to focus on the question of translation, as I cannot here. Again, limits. Not a critique of Eurocentrism. That was day before yesterday. I find it very, very boring. The critique of Eurocentrism is completely Eurocentric. Now, what can a literary education, hand in hand with philosophy, do? Although, of course, it can also do the opposite. Like most things, you know, it isn't good by itself. From my point of view, with effort, concentrate on working out the outlines of the subject in subalternity and or capitalism, both bottom and top, to attempt to rearrange desires. But you can't do that if you don't work out group epistemology in some way. A teacher's task is to learn that, not like a shrink, but very broad outlines. I have intellectual labor conversations, repeating the same thing in 1 million training sessions with examples in Bengali. As I try to teach teachers how to teach by using intellectual labor to produce intellectual labor in students, as against digital idealism and ease of learning and knowledge management at the top. But I'm going to give you a little bit of the bottom. So here's some of it. Now I'm going to say it in Bengali, of course, Nayanika will understand, but you will see how it remains incomprehensible. This is me teaching, okay? I'm not reading someone else's words. And I'm saying, I'm doing exactly what I did with them. I talked, and then I gave it to them in English, which they didn't understand. So here it is. Ami ki korchi? Matha khatachi. Ki proshno korle chhatro matha khatabe. Dhoirjo dharo, bole dio na. Amar kotha shunbar jonno koro na. This too is, of course, an order. The condition binding unconditionality. I'm saying, don't do it to obey me. Matha khatano shekhano jay na. It is interesting that khatano is also used for financial speculation. Taka khatano, taka, money. So the connection with human capital comes loud and clear, just as Ramprasad Sen connected intellectual labor with agricultural labor in the 18th century. I have called this epistemological performance. I have insisted that this needs a training of the imagination. As you can see, it involves rearranging my own imaginative resources as well. I have named it aesthetic education, and the word aesthetic here is not from the German 18th century. I explain that in my book. For our purposes today, I'm calling this the humanities at work. Without this sort of general and customized training of the imagination, it is impossible to remember that, although to measure societies at large, we need nation-states, regions, and other categories for quantification, these do not give us a sense of development in any rich sense, pun intended. I'm sharing with you my conviction that sustainable underdevelopment is the rule, and the peculiarly intractable notion of developing, studyable though quantifiable through quantifiable indexes, whose items are quantifiably expandable, are not isomorphic with epistemological change. They do not have, nor isotemporal, they do not have the same forms and the same speed with the change in mindset. That's what I'm trying to say. Let us take a look, and I quote, "The education component of the Human Development Index is now measured by means of years of schooling, quantity, years of schooling for adults aged 25 years, and expected years of schooling for children of school entering age." This is from the most recent report of the Human Development Index 2013. Mean years of schooling is estimated based on educational attainment data from censuses and surveys available in the UNESCO Institute for Statistics database and Barrow and Lee 2010 methodology. Expected years of schooling estimates are based on enrollment by age at all levels of education and population of official school age for each level of education. Expected years of schooling is capped at 18 years. The indicators are normalized using a minimum value of 0, and maximum values are set to the actual observed maximum value of mean years of schooling from the countries in the time series 1980 to 2012, that is 13.3 years estimated for the United States in 2010. Expected years of schooling is maximized by its cap at 18 years. The education index is the geometric mean of two indices. End of quote. Please do not imagine that I'm undervaluing the Human Development Index or the United Nations Development Programme, although of the latter's feudality without feudalism, I have had personal experience that is not necessarily conducive of hope, and I'm not alone in this opinion. However, the HDI, Human Development Index, introducing education, life expectancy, and income in with economic growth was an unbelievable advance. I remember Amartya Sen saying at Mahbubul Haq's memorial service at the United Nations in 1998 that the HDI had to be tough as all the other indices in order to change them. I'm also aware that the HDI attempts to make its measure more meaningful by disaggregation, by introducing measures for inequality, by questioning the relationship between material growth and human development ceaselessly. I'm just suggesting that in order to fulfill these goals, its measurement work must be supplemented by the humanities-style work that I'm proposing, the attempt to access the epistemology of the ungeneralizable subaltern groups of the world. They're by definition ungeneralizable, and I can discuss that as well. And many people don't know this. This terrible book by Vivek Chibba, for example. The ungeneralizable subaltern groups of the world as it attempts to rearrange the overgeneralized, digitally idealistic epistemology of the elite. In order for the Human Development Index to be supple enough to become real rather than merely powerful, it should not be replaced or opposed, but supplemented by the humanities-style reading skills. Humanities, in this sense, is a form of imaginative activism that must permeate qualitative and quantitative welfare and economic disciplinary training, as well as human rights training. Currently, it is this last group, human rights, that shares something with the humanities, at least in select elite universities in the United States. In these programs, however, human rights legalisms trump the slow reading skills of the humanities. In the same way, when a former officer of the National Council for Educational Research and Training in India had worked at making environmentalism as a form of imaginative activism a part of all secondary education, the textbook interests who wanted environmental textbooks for different disciplines defeated this project. I'm therefore absolutely not suggesting that it is easy. But what good is it to reject a method of studying developing societies because it is too hard? I cannot promise you a rose garden. Currently, there is so little understanding of this that these absurd remarks are made in all innocence. And I'm once again going to quote from the 2013 report of the Human Development Index, which says, because they're statisticians, that education is too slow an index by which to measure development. Therefore, remember, Human Development Index, they call it traditional. It came out in 1998. It's too slow, therefore it would be best to give it up. Also, life expectancy, too slow. I quote, "It is difficult to use the HDI to monitor changes in human development in the short term because two of its components, namely life expectancy and mean years of schooling, change too slowly. To address, this is a quotation, to address this limitation, components that are more sensitive to short-term changes could be used for national purposes, possibly under a different name." Yes, the old development stuff. For example, the rate of employment, the percent of population with access to health services, or the daily caloric intake as a percentage of recommended intake could be used in place of the traditional indicators of the HDI. Thus, the usefulness and versatility of the HDI as an analytical tool for HD at the national and subnational levels would be enhanced if countries choose components that reflect their priorities and problems and are sensitive to their development levels, rather than rigidly using the three components presented in the HDI of the global HDRs. According to this concluding remark on the 2013 Human Rights Report, Human Development Index report, The Rise of the South, education, the kingpin of human development, is not useful for human development analysis because it moves too slowly. No analytical tool that is committed to speed as a measure of efficiency can actually get a grip on human development, and certainly not the process of developing, as in developing societies. To the developed societies protesters, the occupiers of Wall Street, I wrote about the subprime crisis as an example of unsustainable underdevelopment. And I quote, so that you don't think it's just the bottom. This is the bottom, the Human Development Index. I quote myself, "Unless the polity is educated to want social justice, it can be taken in by many different kinds of slogans. It is not a question of subject matter alone, nor of gathering information. It is a question of making minds that will read the information right. It is a question of educating in such a way that the intuitions of democracy and justice for everyone, rather than just self-interest, become habitual." By the way, you know, one of the things that people just don't know how to read is, in India, they're living only on $7 a day. I'm not going to expand on this right now. Working for standards not necessarily motored by competition or being rewarded for leadership, not encouraging role models, one could go on. The pursuit of happiness must be somewhat curbed in the interest of justice for all. And liberty must not be confused with capital flow for a financialization that creates jobs only so people will borrow, flowing in and flowing out at the highest possible rates. Private enterprise is not free. An ill-educated society can be persuaded with the obvious lies of trickle-down economic advantage in jobs created by capitalists, rather than if the state has a robust structure of redistribution. Small business is no longer an unquestioned good when venture capital regularly promises global connections as quickly and as broadly as possible. Any attempt of the state to serve the citizen can be misrepresented as a design on the part of the state to control. Every attempt to save the nation-state economy so that there can be socially just redistribution can be described as state control of private lives. All efforts by the state to serve business and not people, giving everything over to make capital flow in the interest of the financialization of the globe, can be called free enterprise. The extreme right has the same patter here as the critics of governmentality. Therefore, in addition to the legal involvement on the national and international levels, we must continue to emphasize the need persistently to construct a mindset to desire justice for all, from the primary to the post-tertiary level, if a just society is to prevail. This is not an impractical or individualistic lesson. The electorate must learn to read well enough, generation by generation, so the play of metaphors is seen clearly. Social networking is useful only with a mindset willing social justice. As for the human development measurers, their only standard, I quote, when adjusting the Human Development Index to reflect additional concerns, can only be, I quote again, to a commitment to data integrity and rigorous attention to statistical protocol, not to an existentially rich idea of development which might show the limits of their power and demand supplementation to produce mindsets equal to the task at hand. Remember, supplemented, not replaced or opposed, because the impulse towards achieving greater flexibility is already there. It should be mentioned that the world of non-governmental organizations is too deeply folded in with capitalist globalization to be permeable to supplementation by the humanities approach. However carefully honed it might be, the Human Development Index does not touch the quality of education. And that is what produces class apartheid, rape culture and bribe culture, forcing election results by way of violence, and at best, violence as the only recourse to a kind of wild social justice. When, on the other hand, all those wonderful people who prepare these reports send their children to school, considerations of quality become paramount. An example, alas, of sustainable underdevelopment, and even then, education is considered too slow to be useful. There is no development until the index is supplemented by a spirit of equality. That's the conditionality which ties the unconditional idea of liberty. There is no development until the index is supplemented by a spirit of equality. Other people's children is a democratic intuition that travels across class, as I daily find at the rural schools. Whenever I bring up the idea of supplementation with good-hearted development folks, I'm told that such ideas are inconvenient. Who can disagree? But given that democracy is the development of abstract and hospitable judgment, dangerous and incalculable, because one must be hospitable to other ways of thinking, for the sake of all, including others with different interests, who must themselves be trained in such abstract judgment, there is no way around it. Sustainable underdevelopment can be interrogated and combated through the political process. A larger gendered development can be claimed, and the ongoing flow of development not remain an account of the oppositional being nurtured destructively by the feudal left as an alternative, to giving these rational choice leftist descriptions of the subaltern as cannon fodder under the hands of sovereign leaders who are not from them. There's a film that's just been played at Sundance, and it's going to play in Berlin again. It's called Concerning Violence, and for what it's worth, they asked me to give a little preface in the beginning. And really, it's since there is this fantastic film there with archival material from the struggles in Mozambique and Angola, my little preface there is much like what I'm saying tonight, and the film is a great bonus. So if you have a chance to see this, it's made by the Swedish Film Institute by Göran Olsen, Concerning Violence. Take a look, because it really supplements what I'm saying in this dry as dust way. And the ongoing flow of development not remain an account of the oppositional being nurtured destructively by the feudal left as an alternative, while, on the other side, it is an account of the displacement of what used to be called petit bourgeois ideology, the involvement of more and more people, statistically innumerable, into the management of underdevelopment as development. W.E.B. Du Bois has given a masterful account of such a process, admittedly in terms of the mid-19th century conjuncture in the United States, as the development of so-called democracy in the United States in his Black Reconstruction, 1860 to 1880, how abolition democracy changed to an excuse for capitalism. It is a pity that we stop with de Tocqueville, no doubt because Du Bois is seen as belonging to the African-American interest alone. Gramsci understood that the intellectuals and the proletarians, and indeed the subalterns, were riddled by different varieties of prejudice. The goal was to think of a philosophy of education that could provide imaginative training for epistemological performance, knowing differently through rearranged desires for social justice rather than self-interest, quote, developing qualitatively, forever repeated as new generations came in. If Du Bois has been kept in the African-American bloc, Gramsci has been transformed into a culturalist liberal democrat. Gramsci uses the word culture not as anthropology invented it, but as an environment not fully determined by capital logic. From him, we can learn the lesson of affirmative sabotage as he considers his own teachers keeping Croce, but pretty much laying Gentile aside, making a choice. He is careful to remind himself in his jail cell that Croce, from the subaltern south of Italy, like himself, became epistemologically a full northerner, thus distancing himself into, we might say for the moment, a species of double consciousness. That's Gramsci, southern northern. Croce was just northern. It has been suggested that because the colonizers provided the African gentry with what was then called liberal education, perhaps the African intelligentsia was kept away from business, science, and technology, people like Boahen, for example, and others. Such colonial-style humanities education, with power in the hands of the colonizers, is part of what has been described by Ronodit Guho as dominance without hegemony. That is not what we are talking about. Like anything else, education in the humanities cannot exist by itself, uncontaminated by conditions that would threaten it as it is doing today, when those who do have power in the public sector and the private are the ones who show up as perhaps to benefit from the preparation of the soul to produce, I use the word that Lacan also uses, to preparation of the soul to produce the desire for social justice, the work of an activist humanities training. So far, I've been arguing that we, the teachers of the humanities, need a mindset change, what, in my typical turgid way, I have called imaginative training for epistemological performance again and again. We need to think ourselves differently so that we act differently. We are the custodians of the only weapon, not for social change, but life survival, language, definitively also and always vulnerable. We need to change the minds of the policymakers. Language is vulnerable under globalization, loss of connection with mother tongue in a certain class, unless it happens to be a globally viable one. Because of that earlier complaint brought about in the case of Africa, I would like to close with an African example. I want to share with you what I discussed with Hassanat Balogun Yetunde a few days ago. She is a young woman who is a systems analyst at a small, new, rural Nigerian university. That what has been seen, this is what we discussed, as a disadvantage, and you'll soon see uncodified mother tongues, what has been seen as a disadvantage should be rethought as an advantage, and then push for resources. Guadalupe Valdez writes, much harm is done to children in the name of language pedagogy. She is speaking of the first preparation of the human mind, passed on from generation to generation, so that it can use the technological setting to work of science for the betterment of the world, so that citizens' resistance does not stop with either inconsequential violence or, at the other extreme, the development of toolkits by intellectuals organic to capitalist globalization in their worship of the digital. Intellectual labor begins with the training of children slowly. It has been abundantly demonstrated that an at least bilingual primary education lays the foundation not only for learning other languages, including mathematics, digitality, and the like, but also connects the world of social justice and social welfare with the earliest stages of a child's development. By the way, although I'm not an example of anything, and much of our humanities discourse is really contaminated by the fact that the person offers his or her experience as proof of some kind of a generalization, but I just throw this in as an anecdotally. I went, in fact, to a Bengali medium school, and to an extent, it's, I was taught in my mother tongue, in other words. So to an extent, I feel that this was one of the great advantages in my life, so that I can think ethics in a certain way. But also connects the world of social justice and social welfare with the earliest stages of a child's development. The, quote, global languages are first language to only a part of the world, and therefore they have an intrinsic connection to them. Others, and we are talking race, class, and gender here, suffer a loss of connection with their infancy language, and this is an ethical loss as significant as climate change for the world's future. In this connection, and because Africa is never taken as a model, the US local in my neck of the woods is always offered as the global. But Africa is seen only as vulnerable. I would like to refer for a closing moment to an Africa-led project that believes that in order to build human capital, this is Chakwati's word, I mean, someone questioned me on this and I'll be happy to answer. In order to build human capital on an unprecedentedly broad basis, the wealth of mother tongues unsystematized by colonialism must be seized for direct phonetic digitalization. Here the digital can partner its prefiguration in the oral, bypassing the existential impoverishment of the codification practiced in the 19th and 20th centuries. This project will not compete with the established usefulness of the great African languages, Kiswahili, Yoruba, Wolof, Xhosa, etc. It will not impede access to global English. It will rather provide an altogether firmer basis for democratic popular education. There is an urgent need at this historical moment to seize these resilient languages as survivors rather than, quote, endangered, which is all the United Nations can think. This is altogether different from the necessary work of preservation, which must focus on endangered languages. This project uses advanced information technology for the democratic development and interlinking of community and civil society, as well as further research for post-tertiary education in Africa and the rest of the world through the resources of still undocumented but socially viable mother tongues. It will demonstrate that from infancy through advanced education, it is the mother tongue that remains fundamental. I first came into this when I saw Henry Chakava, who certainly has a PhD, speaks English as I do, Ngugi was his teacher and so on, speaking Kimaraoli, which is his uncodified mother tongue, with other PhDs, in fact, a guy who is teaching surrealism at Jomo Kenyatta University, and two other women in the English department at the University of Nairobi. And Henry turns to me, what do I know about Kimaraoli? He says, actually, I'm not speaking Kiswahili, you know. I'm speaking an uncodified mother tongue, which we speak by choice. Simon Gikandi told me the same thing. He teaches at Princeton. We're understanding each other 30%, 40%. But those communication theories which say that people can understand 100%, of course, are either that knowledge management nonsense or wrong. And on the other hand, they have their uses. The greatest translation industry in the world is the translation of how to do for medical things and so on, because these days, since things are produced all over the world, who's going to write those directions? So the last port of call writes them in the original language, then a group translates it into English or French or whatever, and then it's translated back into the original language again to see if the thing was said correctly. Billions of dollars is spent on this. There, of course, you need adequate theories of translation, no problem. But you must know the limits of that as well. So to an extent, it's limit thinking, isn't it? So at any rate, the tracks set down by these languages across the length and breadth of continental Africa, because one is not confined within the outlines of named languages, will strengthen the African unity that is most urgently required as the continent achieves higher human development indices. That also Gikandi and others told me. I'm not an Africanist. It's fantastic that these languages, because not codified, could be flexible. And there are actually tracks, whereas Africa itself has become completely regionalist, in spite of all the talk about African unity. But there are these survival languages that go all the way down and across because they are not impoverished by systematization into named individual languages with grammars. So this is where Dante was. Since these languages are spoken by poor and rich, uneducated and educated alike, used for campaigning, and the project intends to sustain that double focus, it is hoped that the divided polity will heal as a result of this project. I sent the longer piece of which this is a part to Ken Prewitt, a political scientist, colleague, and friend, with whom I think global curriculum at Columbia, and this was his response. I quote Ken. This helped me to realize that I need to spend some time understanding just what scholars in literature do and why. Your words have already helped me understand, he wrote, how complicated and layered is an Arendt quote, where she observes that scientists, now obliged to speak via mathematical symbols that cannot be translated back into speech, move in a world where speech has lost its power, and goes on to say that we therefore have to distrust their political judgments. Your session, he wrote, takes me back to the critical importance of the mother tongue for the preservation of speech, end of quote. Not preservation of speech, Ken, but mature contact with the tense trajectory of the ethical. He's still in there, needs an epistemological change. And common or garden variety literary scholars don't do this anymore, Kenneth. I fight against the self-trivialization of the humanities. So he read quickly and he came to his conclusions, which he no doubt will say in public. But that quick analysis of something that he really didn't know anything about. He's a very high-level guy. He was on the census for both Bush and Obama. A very sweet guy, a good friend. And I'll tell him, look, I trashed you publicly. But nonetheless, you see, this is an example of the top, not the bottom, impatience. No knowledge of limits. Okay, this is my last page. Crystal Bartolovich wrote in Academe, I quote, self-trivialization of the humanities is an example, I quote, coming out of a generally conservative climate into the liberal university, bright students can develop their, quote, critical thinking skills in ways useful to business and government, so long as they don't think too critically for too long. Something that corporate elites do not appear to be concerned will happen. They know their professors are small fish in a very big pond, end of quote. I repeat in conclusion, we need a mindset change, imaginative training for epistemological performance. We need to think ourselves differently so that we act differently. We are the custodians of the only weapon, not for social change, but life survival. Language definitively also and always vulnerable. We need to change the minds of the policymakers. This is why I was telling David that I keep going to the World Economic Forum. I'm not going to be turned off by those terrible knowledge management things. I'll see what can be done. Probably nothing. I'm an idiot, but one needs a few idiots, as Blake knew. So we need to change the minds of the policymakers. In the end, my message to Crystal Bartolovich, with whom I am in solidarity since the early 80s, was, get out of the acceptance of powerlessness as normal. Exactly what happens with the subalterns. Wretchedness is normal. It's got nothing to do with resistance. Get out of the acceptance of powerlessness as normal. Stop us and theming. Acknowledge complicity and act the conjuncture. Get into the protocols of the shifting and contradictory economic, political, ideological overdeterminations, conjuncture, overdeterminations that make up the social text as intimately as you can, and teach to produce a collective complicity being folded together rather than us over against them on the way to unconditional practice, saying yes to the enemy, the most robust form of reading that the humanities can learn to teach. Development is unfolding, top and bottom, with different conditions, contaminating the unconditional. Thank you. You know, I really like this talk. You know why? Exactly 50 minutes. That's my goal. My goal is not content, quantity. 50 minutes, man.
Come sit down.